lot of beginners think vulnerability management is a separate program that lives on a calendar, while incident response is what happens when something goes wrong. In reality, these two disciplines are tightly connected because incidents often reveal exactly which weaknesses mattered most, and vulnerability management is how you reduce the chance that those weaknesses will be exploited again. If incident response is the emergency room, vulnerability management is the long-term care plan that prevents repeat visits. The strategy part matters because scanning and patching alone do not automatically reduce risk. What reduces risk is making smart choices about which vulnerabilities matter most to your environment and which fixes will prevent real harm. Connecting vulnerability management to incident outcomes means you stop treating vulnerabilities as an endless list and start treating them as a map of potential incidents. It also means you use the evidence from incidents to improve your prioritization, your scope, and your follow-through. For brand new learners, the goal is to understand how vulnerability decisions translate into incident impact, so you can reason about risk reduction in a practical way instead of getting lost in technical detail. Start with a clear definition of what a vulnerability is, because people sometimes use the word to mean anything that feels risky. A vulnerability is a weakness that can be exploited to cause harm, and it usually exists in software, configuration, identity practices, or system design. A missing patch can be a vulnerability, but so can an overly broad permission, a weak authentication setting, or an exposed service that should not be exposed. Vulnerability management is the ongoing practice of finding these weaknesses, understanding which ones matter, and reducing them through fixes or compensating controls. The reason it connects to incidents is simple. Incidents are often the result of an exploited vulnerability, or they become worse because a vulnerability allowed the attacker to move or escalate. If you only fix what is obvious after an incident, you may prevent one repeat, but you may miss the broader pattern of weaknesses that would enable similar harm. Strategy means you look for patterns, like repeated weaknesses in identity, repeated exposure of certain services, or repeated delays in patching critical systems. When you connect the dots, you turn vulnerability management into a targeted risk reduction engine. Incident outcomes give you concrete data about which vulnerabilities actually matter in your environment, because not every vulnerability is equally exploitable or equally damaging. For example, a vulnerability in a system that is isolated and rarely used may be less urgent than a vulnerability in a system that is internet-facing and central to operations. An incident might reveal that a vulnerability in an authentication workflow leads directly to account takeover, which then becomes a major risk driver. Another incident might reveal that a configuration weakness allows lateral movement, which turns a small compromise into a broad one. These outcomes teach you which parts of your environment are high value and high risk, and they teach you which control failures have the biggest impact. A vulnerability management strategy that ignores incident outcomes is like a doctor ignoring a patient's history. You might treat symptoms, but you will not address the real drivers of risk. For beginners, this means you should learn to view incidents as feedback, not just as emergencies. The incident is telling you which vulnerabilities are most dangerous and which improvements will matter. A common misunderstanding is to think vulnerability management is mainly about patching, but patching is only one tool in a broader strategy. Sometimes patching is not immediately possible because of operational constraints, and sometimes the vulnerability is not a missing patch at all. Strategy includes compensating controls, like tightening access, reducing exposure, increasing monitoring, or changing how systems are segmented. Strategy also includes scope, meaning which assets are covered and how you ensure coverage stays current as the environment changes. Another part is ownership, meaning someone is responsible for fixing the vulnerability and someone is responsible for verifying that the fix actually happened. If ownership is unclear, vulnerabilities remain open and risk remains. Incidents often expose ownership gaps, such as systems nobody feels responsible for or dependencies that are managed by third parties. A good strategy includes the governance needed to make fixes happen, not just the detection needed to find problems. For beginners, the key is to recognize that vulnerability management is a system of decisions and follow-through, not just a scan report. To connect strategy to incidents, you need to understand how vulnerabilities become incident outcomes, which is essentially a story of pathways. A vulnerability might be used as an entry point, like a weakness that allows an attacker to access a system. Another vulnerability might be used for privilege escalation, allowing the attacker to gain higher access. Another might be used for lateral movement, allowing spread to additional systems. Another might be used for persistence, allowing the attacker to remain present even after you think you remove them. Another might be used for impact, such as disrupting services or altering data. When you examine an incident, you should ask where a vulnerability played a role in that pathway and where controls failed to stop the pathway. This helps you prioritize fixes that break the pathway at key points, which is more effective than randomly fixing low-impact issues. For beginners, thinking in pathways keeps vulnerability management grounded in real harm. It also helps you understand why some vulnerabilities are urgent even if they are not new, because their position in the pathway makes them high leverage. Risk reduction depends on prioritization, and prioritization is where most vulnerability programs struggle because the volume is overwhelming. A strategy that connects to incident outcomes prioritizes based on what was exploited, what nearly was exploited, and what would cause severe impact if exploited next. Incidents reveal both actual and near-miss vulnerabilities, such as a weakness that was present but not used, or a control that nearly failed. Those near misses are important because they indicate where the organization got lucky. A mature strategy does not rely on luck. It closes the gaps that luck covered. Prioritization also considers exposure, such as whether a system is reachable by attackers, and criticality, such as whether the system supports important business functions. Another factor is exploitability, which is how practical it is for an attacker to use the vulnerability in real conditions. For beginners, the takeaway is that prioritization is not just about severity labels. It is about the combination of exposure, criticality, and real-world pathways to harm. Incident outcomes provide evidence that helps you make those decisions better. Another important connection is that incidents often reveal that the biggest vulnerabilities are not single software flaws, but repeated weaknesses in process. For example, if an incident shows that patching was delayed because of unclear ownership or testing bottlenecks, then the root vulnerability is not only the missing patch. It is the process weakness that makes missing patches common and long-lived. Similarly, if incidents repeatedly involve weak authentication practices, then a vulnerability management strategy that focuses only on software patches will miss a major risk driver. Connecting incidents to vulnerability strategy means you widen your view to include configuration, identity, and operational practices as vulnerability categories. It also means you treat recurring patterns as strategic targets, because fixing a pattern can reduce many future incidents at once. For beginners, this is a powerful idea because it shifts you from whack-a-mole to systemic improvement. If you can reduce the conditions that create vulnerabilities, you reduce risk more efficiently than by chasing every single item in a list. Validation and measurement are also essential if your strategy is meant to reduce incident outcomes rather than just produce reports. After an incident, teams often rush to close tickets, but closing a ticket does not always mean the vulnerability is truly fixed or that risk is reduced. Strategy includes verifying that fixes were applied correctly and that the environment behaves as expected afterward. It also includes tracking whether the same types of vulnerabilities show up again, which is a sign that the process is not improving. Over time, you want to see a reduction in incidents tied to known vulnerability classes, such as fewer incidents caused by unpatched exposures or fewer incidents that spread due to misconfigurations. This is where incident metrics and vulnerability metrics should connect, because leaders want to see that vulnerability work produces fewer incidents and less impact. For beginners, the key is to remember that a vulnerability program is successful when it changes incident patterns, not when it generates a large number of findings. The finding list is the starting point, not the finish line. Communication between vulnerability management and incident response teams is another critical link, because these groups can easily operate in separate worlds. Incident responders often learn the hard truth about what was exploited and what mattered, but if that information does not flow back into vulnerability prioritization, the same gaps may remain. Vulnerability teams often know which weaknesses are widespread and which systems are chronically behind, but if that information does not inform incident planning, responders may be surprised by weak areas during a crisis. A healthy strategy includes a feedback loop where incident learnings update vulnerability priorities and vulnerability trends inform incident readiness. This feedback loop also supports better reporting to leaders, because you can explain how vulnerability work is reducing specific incident outcomes. Beginners should see this as a practical collaboration, not as a political negotiation. When the loop is healthy, the organization becomes less reactive over time because it is learning from its own experience and adjusting before the next incident happens. A common misconception is that vulnerability management risk reduction is only about preventing initial compromise, but incidents often become severe because of vulnerabilities that enable spread and persistence. Even if you cannot prevent every initial access, you can reduce the likelihood that a small compromise becomes a major incident by addressing vulnerabilities that enable lateral movement, privilege escalation, and weak segmentation. This is why strategy should include a focus on containment-friendly architecture and access control hygiene, not just patching internet-facing systems. Another misconception is that vulnerability strategy can be static, like a monthly scan and patch cycle, when in reality attacker behavior and organizational changes can shift what matters. Incidents are a strong signal that the threat landscape for your organization is real and evolving. Strategy should be flexible enough to elevate priorities when new evidence emerges, such as when an incident reveals a previously underestimated weakness. For beginners, the key is to understand that vulnerability management is dynamic risk management. It should respond to the environment and to incident evidence, not just to routine schedules. To tie it all together, connecting vulnerability management strategy to incident outcomes means using incidents as feedback that sharpens your prioritization and your understanding of what reduces risk. Vulnerabilities are not just items to patch. They are potential pathways to harm, and incidents show you which pathways are real in your environment. A strong strategy considers patches, configuration hardening, identity controls, compensating controls, scope coverage, ownership, and validation. It prioritizes based on exposure, criticality, exploitability, and most importantly, evidence from actual incidents and near misses. It measures success by changes in incident frequency, severity, and recurrence, not by the size of a findings list. When vulnerability management and incident response share information and reinforce each other, the organization becomes less dependent on luck and more dependent on disciplined risk reduction. For brand new learners, the main takeaway is that vulnerability management is not busy work that competes with incident response. It is one of the most direct ways to make incidents less likely and less damaging because it targets the weaknesses that incidents exploit. When strategy is connected to outcomes, every fix has a purpose, and that purpose is a safer, more resilient organization.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.